The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 16. This is the last chapter of the book. Going to be a couple videos, though. When Johnny woke up, he found that he was lying in a hospital bed. It was daytime, and cold winter light was streaming in through large windows. Next to him, sitting in the armchair by the bed, was the professor. He was wearing an egg-stained brown sweater, and he was smoking one of his eternal black and gold cigarettes. He grinned broadly at Johnny. "So," he exclaimed in a pretend gruff voice, "you've decided to favor us with your presence at last. And about time, too. How do you feel?" Johnny was still dazed and uncertain. He didn't know quite how he felt, but now he realized that there was something on his head. He reached up and touched the stiff white cloth bandage. Then he remembered being out on the balcony and getting hit on the head. "Have I been—" he began, but he found he was having trouble putting words together. He felt vaguely dizzy, and when he moved, a throbbing headache started, just above his left eye. "Have you been indeed?" said the professor, smiling gently. "You have been totally unconscious for about 2 days. It's a concussion. No, don't worry, it's not fatal. I had one myself once, when I was hit on the head with a shell casing at the Battle of the Argonne Forest. You'll be up and around in a few days, in case you're wondering. You're in a hospital in North Conway, New Hampshire. It's the nearest one we could find. North Conway is a rich little town where people come to ski and drink and sit around and be bored. You should see the overpriced dump that I'm staying in. It's a fake Swiss chalet with cuckoo clocks and everything. Fortunately, it isn't the skiing season yet, or the room would have cost me half my year's salary at the college. And the bed is lumpy, too. Would you believe it?" The professor crabbed on. Johnny grinned and listened appreciatively. He knew that this was cheerful crabbing, a sign that the professor was in a good mood. As the professor talked, Johnny found that the cobwebs in his head were clearing away. He remembered why he had come up here. The will, the reward, and everything. He thought about Mrs. Woodley, and Chad, and Godfrey de Bouillon. There were a million questions that he wanted to ask. Is the mansion all burned down?" The professor nodded. "It is indeed. Burned to a nice crunchy crisp. It's just a heap of rubble now, but it was still going strong when Fergie and I arrived on the scene. "Fergie!" exclaimed Johnny, interrupting. "What was he doing up here?" The professor eyed Johnny sardonically. "He came up here with me to rescue you, and you will have to admit, my friend, that you needed some rescuing. You were lying in the bushes near the mansion when we found you. The mansion was going like a house afire. Flames shooting out of all the windows, walls crashing down all over the place. Well, Fergie, or Byron, as I prefer to call him, Byron and I fought our way out, and it was hot, let me tell you. But we got you and pulled you free just before the whole bloody wall came down. Bluey, crash, bam. Right where you'd been not a moment before. How about that, eh?" Johnny was silent, so he had missed death by just that much. "Mrs. Woodley probably started the fire," the professor went on as he lit another cigarette. "And she started the earthquake and the lightning and all the other fireworks that helped wreck the mansion. She did it by a remote control, with the aid of a very strange witchcraftical box she found when she was tossing around out at the estate, looking for the will. And how do I know that? Because of a diary that I found in the bedroom of the dear, sweet, departed old—" "Departed? You mean she's—" The professor nodded solemnly. "Yes, I'm afraid so. Kindly old Mrs. Woodley, the proprietor of the Friendly Squam House, has gone to glory. Or she has gone to some place, at any rate. They found her in her bedroom, slumped over that witch box I told you about. Heart attack, I'm told. If she were alive, she'd have a lot to answer for. According to her diary, she did in Chad Glomus and 3 other people she found poking around the estate. She was obsessed with her brother's will, terrified somebody would find it and it would turn out that she had been cut off without a nickel. Mrs. Woodley was a clever old bat, I'll give her that. Like you, she figured out the Staunton Herald part of the puzzle, but she couldn't get any farther. Did you manage to figure it all out? The tea shop sign and everything?" Johnny frowned. "Sort of, only I didn't know it when I got the last clue. I didn't realize what it was. I thought I'd got rooked." "Do you want to hear about it?" The professor nodded. And as he smoked, Johnny told him about the inscription over the chapel door. He explained about the 2 yees and the can of bouillon cubes and the statue of Godfrey de Bouillon. "And so, I think that the will has got to be inside of the statue," Johnny concluded. "I mean, it stands to reason that's where it'd be. Do you think you could have the police go and find out if it's really there?" The professor considered this. Well, I guess we'd better have them investigate the matter. The mansion is just a ruin now, as I said before, but the statue is probably there somewhere in the rubble. Godfrey de Bouillon, huh? Well, while I was waiting for you to recover, I read the little guidebook that you had in your coat pocket, and I did notice the part about the 9 worthies. Yeah, said Johnny. Who were they, anyway? The professor smiled smugly, as he always did when he knew something that somebody else didn't know. They were a sort of hit parade of warriors and heroes of the ancient world, he said. Let's see, there's Joshua, David, Judas, Maccabees, Hector, Alexander, don't rush me. Ah, yes, there's Julius Caesar and King Arthur, good old Charlemagne, and of course, our soupy old friend Godfrey de Bouillon, the noted knight and leader of the Crusades. That's 9, isn't it? And in case you're interested, I also know all about the inscription over the chapel door and what it means, but I'll bore you with that some other time. We have more important things to discuss now. The professor's jaunty, kidding manner disappeared. He grew serious and solemn. Did you know that Fergie and I were arrested? He asked. Johnny was stunned. You were? What for? For arson, trespassing, and attempted burglary. Those are all the charges, I think, though there may be more. You see, as soon as we had dragged you away from the burning building, we heard this incredible racket. It was the firemen and policemen bashing open the gate in the fence to get in. Yes, indeedy, there must have been about 8 fire trucks and I don't know how many police cars, and luckily there was also an ambulance. And when the cops found us, they figured we had set the fire. Can you imagine? I mean, what a bunch of ninnies. Johnny was worried. Are you going to have to go to jail? The professor chuckled and shook his head. No, we aren't going to jail. You see, in a case of this sort, the owners of the property would have to prefer charges. As you know, the owners are the surviving members of the Glomus family, and when they found out about Mrs. Woodley, Mr. Glomus's sister that was, and the thing that was discovered in the ruins of the mansion, and all the other things that were scattered all over the ground of the estate, well, they were in no mood to prefer charges against anybody. Johnny's mouth dropped open. Things? What things? The professor smiled wryly and flicked the ash off the end of his cigarette. Oh, not much, just a few hard-to-explain items. First, the police found the mummified body in the ruins of the house. From the clothes and the ring and the wallet and the other personal belongings, they have concluded reluctantly that it is the body of Chad Glomus. They're going to have to consult dental records to be sure, but for myself, I have no doubt that it's the young man who disappeared early in October. Nobody can figure out how the body came to be. I didn't tell you everything, said Johnny, interrupting. I mean, Fergie and me, we were with Chad just before he died. We kind of wanted to keep it a secret. Yes, said the professor quietly, I know. Fergie has already spilled the beans, and I must say, it is quite an amazing tale. There's more, too. The police decided to do a thorough search of all the buildings on the estate, and what do you suppose they found in Mr. Glomus's mausoleum? The bodies of 3 other people who disappeared up here during the last few years. They were mummies, too, and they were standing up stiff as boards against a wall. They were all local characters. 2 old derelicts, and a woman who lived in a tar-paper shack near Mount Chahora. They all must have made the mistake of breaking into the estate and nosing around. Mrs. Woodley found out, and that was the end of them. The professor paused for breath. He heaved a deep sigh and folded his arms. Well, now, would you like to see what the newspapers have been making of all this? Without waiting for an answer, the professor reached down beside his armchair, picked up a thick sheaf of newspapers, and threw them onto Johnny's bed. They were all copies of the Manchester Union Leader, the most popular paper in New Hampshire. Johnny looked at the headline that was lying on top. Horror, Mummies in Serial Magnate's Tomb. He flipped to the next one and read, The Witch of Kankamangas Center. Another said, Was Chad murdered? Mystery deepens. Johnny flipped quickly through the stack. Oh my gosh, he said. It was not much of a comment, but it was the only one he could come up with. You see, said the professor, cocking his head to one side and grinning in that know-it-all way that he had. This whole shindig has given the Glomus family some very undesirable publicity, and as far as I can tell, they would like to have it all hushed up as quickly as possible. So unless I miss my guess, they're not going to charge the 3 of us with anything. There will, however, be an inquest. There has to be when 4 bodies are discovered. And you know something? I would love to know what those crime lab clowns are going to say about those mummies. I wonder what sort of silly, trashy, pseudo-scientific flummery they will... Hey, said Johnny, interrupting again. He sat up suddenly, and then, as a sharp, searing pain slashed through his head, he sank back onto the pillow. We We have to do something right now. We have to get the cops to go out to the mansion and look inside of that statue and see if the will's there. I mean, Grandma's sick, and if I don't get the reward money right away, she might die. Please, Professor, can't you get him to do something right now? Can you?" The professor put his hand over his face. "For Pete's sake," he said through his fingers, "is that why you went after the will? John, as Jimmy Durante would say, you have been laboring under a misapprehension. Your grandmother isn't dying. The operation was a success, a complete and unqualified success. Of course, she's no spring chicken, but still, good grief, why didn't you ask somebody?" A tear trickled down Johnny's cheek. "I was scared. I got all this bad news about Dad and all, and I thought the world was coming to an end, and then I found that letter from the undertakers, so I thought—" The professor nodded somberly. "I see it all now. What a comedy of errors. John, my lad, do you know what that letter was probably about?" Johnny sniffed. He took a tissue from the box on the table and blew his nose. "Nope. What was it about?" The professor grinned. "A few years ago, your grandfather's brother Willie died. He was next door to being a bum, and after the funeral, Willie's wife wrote a check to the funeral parlor, and the check bounced. Well, the undertakers had a fit, and they got after Willie's widow, and she went to your grandpa for help. There was a big fight in your grandpa's family about who would foot the bill, and your grandpa finally persuaded his other brother, Vic, to pay for it. Vic is a filthy rich farmer up in Menominee, Wisconsin, who could afford it. So I suspect, though I'm not absolutely sure, that the letter you saw was just a note from somebody at the funeral parlor thanking your grandpa because he had managed to pry the money out of his tight-fisted brother. I'd be willing to bet that's all there was to that ridiculous letter. And next time you have any doubts about the letter's contents, steam the bloody thing open and peek inside, for heaven's sake." With an exasperated humph, the professor ground out a cigarette in the ashtray. He dug another one out of his pocket and lit it. Johnny's lower lip began to tremble. Tears were rolling down his cheeks. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't know. The professor was shocked. He hadn't meant to make Johnny cry. With an agonized look on his face, he jumped out of his chair and rushed over to Johnny's bed. He took the cigarette out of his mouth, and after looking about distractedly, he dunked it in a glass of water that stood on the bedside table. When he turned back to Johnny, the professor's eyes were filled with tears. "Oh, John," he cried as he seized the bedsheet in his hands and began to twist it. "Please don't cry. I'm just a cranky old man, and I can't help sounding grumpy sometimes. It's one of my many faults." Johnny smiled and dried his eyes with a tissue. It's okay, Professor," he said, smiling. "I just feel kind of weird right now. It's easy to cry, and I'm happy I'm not going to be alone in the world. That makes me want to cry, too." "Well, you mustn't," said the professor, and he smiled, a weak, wan, half-joking smile. Still twisting the bedsheet, he stared hard at Johnny. "Look," he said in a grave but gentle voice, I think I understand why you did what you did, and in connection with that I have something to tell you. I was going to save this for later, but your dad has been found." Johnny's eyes opened wide, and he exclaimed, "When?" But the professor replied quickly, "I'll give you the details later. I just wanted you to know he's all right, but even if he hadn't been found, and even if both your grandmother and grandfather were to die, I'd still be there to take care of you. I've never had any children of my own, but if they'd let me, I'd adopt you. I'm only 70, you know. My father made it to 103, and his father was 98 when the horse he was riding threw him. You don't need to worry about ever being an orphan." And that is where we will pause.